He did not wait for her salute. He did not wait for her to speak a single word. The moment Commander Daniel Brooks saw Major Emily Carter step off that A-10 onto his flight deck, he turned to his men and barked the order that would humiliate her in front of 200 sailors. "Get that broken-down mud fighter off my deck before it embarrasses this entire carrier." That single sentence, spoken with a sneer, was about to collide with a truth Brooks never saw coming. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end of this story. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The wind on the flight deck of the USS Liberty was not gentle that morning. It cut sideways, carrying the smell of jet fuel and salt water, and it seemed to know somehow that something unusual was about to happen. Sailors moved in practiced rhythm across the deck, boots pounding steel, voices shouting numbers and coordinates back and forth in the clipped language of men who had done this 10,000 times before. And then, in the middle of that rhythm, something broke it. An aircraft that did not belong. A U.S. Air Force, A-10 Thunderbolt II, squat and ugly and beautiful in its own brutal way, sat parked where a Navy fighter should have been. Sailors slowed as they walked past it. Some laughed under their breath. Others simply stared, the way people stare at something that shouldn't exist. And standing beside it, arms crossed, jaw set, was a woman none of them recognized. Major Emily Carter did not look nervous. She did not look like someone who had wandered onto the wrong ship by mistake. She looked like someone who had made peace a long time ago with being underestimated. "Who let that thing on my deck?" The voice belonged to Commander Daniel Brooks, and it cut through the wind like a blade. He came striding across the flight deck with the kind of fury that men in his position rarely bothered to hide because, on a carrier, his word was close enough to law. Emily turned to face him. She didn't flinch. "I did, Commander. Or more accurately, my orders did." Brooks stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the disbelief working across his face like a physical thing. "Your orders?" "Yes, sir." "Do you have any idea what you're standing next to, Major?" He gestured at the aircraft behind her without even looking at it, as if it were beneath his attention. "That is a land-based attack aircraft. It doesn't have a tail hook. It doesn't have a reinforced landing gear built for carrier impact. It was never, not once, not in the history of this program, designed to operate off a ship like mine." "I'm aware, Commander." "Then you're also aware that what you're proposing is insane." Emily's eyes didn't waver. "I'm aware that it's difficult." "Difficult?" Brooks let out a short, sharp laugh, the kind that had no humor in it at all. He turned to the sailors nearby, spreading his arms as if inviting them to share the joke. "She says difficult." A few of the younger sailors chuckled, more out of nervous instinct than genuine amusement. Nobody wanted to be the one who didn't laugh when the commander laughed. Emily let the laughter pass over her like wind over a rock. She had heard worse. She had heard it in briefing rooms, in cockpits, in hospital quarters, after missions that should have killed her and didn't. Laughter had stopped being able to touch her a long time ago. "Commander," she said, "I didn't come here to convince you that this is easy. I came here because 14 American soldiers are trapped on an island 600 miles from the ship, and every aircraft capable of reaching them and staying with them has already been destroyed or grounded." That landed differently than her first sentence had. Brooks's smile faded just slightly, just enough that Emily noticed. 14 soldiers, he repeated. "Yes, sir." "And command thinks the answer is..." He gestured again at the A-10, and this time there was something almost pained in the motion. "This. Command thinks the answer is whoever can get there and stay there long enough to keep them alive," Emily said. "I happen to be the only pilot in this theater qualified to fly this particular aircraft. So yes, Commander, the answer is this." For a long moment, Brooks said nothing. Around them, the deck had gone unnervingly quiet, sailors slowing their work without meaning to, drawn toward the confrontation the way people are always drawn toward the edge of something about to break. Then Brooks shook his head, and the hard edge came back into his voice. "I don't care what command thinks it knows about your qualifications, Major. I care about the safety of my ship, my crew, and the men and women working this flight deck. And I am telling you right now in front of witnesses that there is no version of this plan that ends without a burning aircraft at the bottom of the Pacific. With respect, Commander, that's not your call to make." It is absolutely my call to make. This is my carrier. And that, Emily said quietly, is my aircraft. And those 600 miles from here are my responsibility. Brooks stared at her, and for the first time something flickered behind his eyes that wasn't quite anger. It might have been curiosity. It might have been the beginning of doubt. But he buried it fast, the way men like him always did, beneath another layer of command voice certainty. Get her to the briefing room, he snapped to the nearest officer. Let's see exactly how insane this plan actually is before I let it anywhere near my flight deck again. He turned and walked away without waiting for a response, his boots striking the deck with the finality of a door slamming shut. Emily watched him go, and for just a moment, alone amid the noise of the ship, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what she was carrying. Not fear. She had burned through fear a long time ago, somewhere over a jungle canopy with tracer fire lighting up the dark. What she felt now was something heavier. Urgency. The kind that sits behind the ribs like a stone and doesn't let you breathe all the way in. 14 soldiers, one of them a man she owed her life to. She hadn't told Brooks that part yet. The briefing room was smaller than she expected, lit by the cold blue glow of monitors and a single overhead light that buzzed faintly, as if it too were impatient. Brooks was already there when she arrived, along with two other officers she didn't recognize, and a woman near the back whose uniform marked her as intelligence, Lieutenant Sarah Kim, according to the name stitched into her jacket. Sit, Brooks said, not quite an invitation. Emily sat. Kim pulled up a satellite image on the main screen. A small island, ringed with dense jungle, a thin gray scar of a clearing near its center. This is where they're pinned down, Kim said. Her voice was steady, professional. The voice of someone trained to deliver bad news without letting it shake her. Captain Michael Reynolds and his 13-man reconnaissance team were inserted 2 nights ago to confirm enemy troop movement in this sector. Instead, they walked into a staging ground for what we now believe is a battalion-strength force, possibly larger. A battalion, Brooks said, against 13 men. 14 with Captain Reynolds, Kim corrected quietly. Emily felt something tighten in her chest at the name. She kept her face still. They've been holding a defensive perimeter for 31 hours, Kim continued. 3 wounded, 1 critical. They're low on ammunition, they're low on water, and every hour that passes, the enemy tightens the circle a little further. An air support? Emily asked. That's the problem. Kim brought up a second image, a debris field, black smoke curling into a gray sky. We sent in 2 FA-18s at first light yesterday. They made contact, took heavy ground fire, and 1 aircraft was lost. The pilot ejected and was recovered, but barely. The other jet returned with critical damage. So Command's answer, Brooks said, leaning forward, was to send an aircraft with no history of carrier operations, flown by a pilot none of us have worked with, to fly directly back into the exact engagement zone that already cost us 1 jet. The F/A-18S are too fast, Emily said before Kim could answer. They can hit a target and be gone in seconds, but they can't loiter. They can't stay low, stay slow, and provide sustained cover while a ground team holds position or a rescue helicopter comes in. That's not a criticism of the aircraft, Commander. It's physics. It's what they were built for, and it's not what those men need right now. And the A-10 is. The A-10 was built for exactly this. Low, slow, armored to survive ground fire that would shred anything else in the sky. It can circle those soldiers for an hour, 2 hours longer if I manage the fuel right, and put rounds exactly where they're needed without ever leaving them alone. Brooks studied her for a long moment. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, it's necessary. There's a difference. One of the other officers, a younger man with a nameplate reading Ortiz, cleared his throat. Commander, if I may, Major Carter's service record backs this up. 3 tours, 2 distinguished flying crosses. She's flown low-cover missions in conditions most of us wouldn't survive. Brooks didn't look away from Emily. Impressive record. Doesn't change the fact that this ship has never launched an aircraft like that off this deck, and there's a reason for it. I know the reasons, Emily said. No tailhook means no assisted stop on landing, which means this is a one-way flight. I fly out. I don't fly back to this ship. No catapult connection means I need every foot of that runway just to get airborne. And even then, it's going to Be close. I've done the math 100 times since I got the orders, Commander. I know exactly how thin the margin is. Then you know it might not work. I know it might not, Emily said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. But I also know that if I don't try, there are 14 men on that island who have no chance at all. So the question isn't whether this is safe. The question is whether this ship is willing to give them the only chance they have got. The room went silent. Even the buzzing overhead lights seemed to quiet for a moment. Brooks leaned back in his chair, and for the first time, Emily saw something crack behind the hard shell of his authority. He looked suddenly like a man doing math he didn't want to be doing, weighing his ship, his crew, his command, against 14 lives that weren't his to save or lose. Lieutenant Kim, he said finally, without looking away from Emily, get me everything we have on that team. Names, status, last contact. Kim nodded and began pulling up files. Names scrolled across the screen. Soldiers frozen in ID photographs. Young faces trying to look serious for a camera. None of them could have known would matter this much one day. And then Emily saw it. Captain Michael Reynolds. The photograph was older than she remembered him looking, but the eyes were the same. Steady, certain. The eyes of a man who had once thrown himself between her and a burning fuselage on a night neither of them talked about anymore. Her breath caught, just slightly, just enough that Kim glanced her way. Major, you recognize the name? Emily hesitated. Every instinct told her to keep it professional, to keep the mission clean of anything that looked like emotion Brooks could use against her. But the moment stretched, and she realized that lying about it now would only make it worse later. I know him, she said quietly. Captain Reynolds pulled me out of a burning aircraft 4 years ago. Under fire. He didn't have to. His team was already clear. The room absorbed that for a moment. Even Brooks said nothing. He saved my life, Emily continued, and I never got the chance to repay that. I'm not telling you this because I want sympathy, Commander. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that I am not asking you to gamble your ship on some abstract mission. I am asking you to let me go get a man who once refused to leave me behind, back when there was nothing in it for him except doing the right thing. Brooks looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that Emily couldn't quite read. That's exactly the kind of thing, he said slowly, that gets people killed. Emotion in a cockpit, personal stakes clouding judgment. Or, Emily said, it's exactly the kind of thing that makes someone fly through hell and come out the other side, because failure isn't an option they're willing to accept. Silence again, longer this time. Ortiz shifted in his seat. Kim kept her eyes on the screen, though Emily could tell she wasn't really reading it anymore. Finally, Brooks stood, walked to the screen, and stared at the satellite image of the island, the thin gray clearing where 14 men were running out of time. Get me the flight deck specs, he said, not turning around. Runway length, current wind conditions, weight tolerances for that airframe. I want real numbers, not estimates. Commander, Ortiz said carefully, are you authorizing? I'm not authorizing anything yet, Brooks snapped. I'm finding out if it's even mathematically possible before I let anyone convince me to risk this ship on a maybe. But something in his voice had changed. The certainty was gone. What replaced it was something more dangerous. In its own way, the sound of a man who had just realized his own convictions might be wrong. Emily allowed herself the smallest breath of relief. Not victory, not yet. Just the first crack in a wall she'd need to bring down entirely if she was going to get airborne before it was too late. Outside, the wind was picking up. On the flight deck, mechanics had gathered near the A-10 without orders, drawn by rumor and curiosity, murmuring among themselves about the strange aircraft and the pilot who thought she could fly it off a ship that had never been built to launch it. One of them was Chief Petty Officer Robert Hayes, a man who had spent 19 years keeping Navy jets alive through conditions that would have killed lesser machines. He walked slow circles around the A-10, running a hand along its hull, feeling the dents and scars of a life spent absorbing punishment other aircraft would never have survived. She's built like a damn tank, one of the younger mechanics said beside him. She's built to take a hit and keep flying, Hayes said quietly. That's not the same thing. You think it's really going to fly off this deck, Chief? Hayes didn't answer right away. He crouched near the landing gear, studying the way it had been reinforced. Hastily, but not carelessly, For a mission somebody somewhere had clearly expected to be difficult from the start. I think, he said finally, somebody's about to find out exactly what this bird can do. And I think we'd better make sure we did our job right, because if we didn't, there won't be a second chance to fix it. He stood, wiped his hands on his coveralls, and looked toward the superstructure of the ship, where the briefing room lights glowed faintly through a small window. Get me the maintenance logs, he said, all of them. If that pilot's really going, I want this aircraft ready before anybody upstairs finishes arguing about whether she should be. Back in the briefing room, the numbers were not kind. Ortiz read them off a tablet, his voice flat in the way people's voices go flat when they're delivering something they don't want to say out loud. Standard carrier deck length, roughly 1,000 feet. The A-10's typical takeoff distance under full combat load, closer to 4,000 feet on a standard runway. Even stripped down, even with a headwind working in her favor, we're talking about a margin so thin it barely qualifies as a margin at all. And if the wind isn't in her favor, Brooks asked. Ortiz didn't answer. He didn't need to. Emily kept her expression steady, though inside something cold moved through her chest. She had known the numbers would be bad. She hadn't expected to hear them stated so plainly, in a room full of people whose job it was to keep her alive, all of them realizing at the same moment just how close to impossible this really was. There has to be a way to buy more runway, she said. Reposition equipment, clear the deck completely, get every ounce of unnecessary weight off that aircraft. We can clear the deck, Ortiz said. We can strip the airframe down to the bone. But Major, even in the best-case scenario, you're looking at a takeoff roll that eats almost the entire available runway with barely any stall margin left when you leave the deck. If the engines hesitate for even half a second, I understand the risk, Lieutenant. With respect, ma'am, I don't think anyone in this room fully understands the risk except maybe you, and I'm not sure that's a comfort to anybody. The words hit harder than Ortiz probably meant them to. Emily felt them land, felt the truth in them, and didn't look away. You're right, she said quietly. I'm the only one who's going to be in that cockpit when the deck runs out beneath me, and I've made peace with that because the alternative is 14 men dying on an island because everyone decided the math was too frightening to attempt. Brooks was quiet for a long moment, staring at the numbers on the screen as if he could will them into something less terrifying. Get me the Admiral, he said finally. Kim looked up sharply. Sir, I'm not signing off on this alone. If we're about to risk this ship's flight deck, my crew, and this pilot's life on a takeoff that even our own numbers say is barely survivable, I want it on record that Command authorized it with full knowledge of the risk. That could take hours, Commander, Kim said. Communication windows out here aren't instant, and if the Admiral wants a full risk briefing before authorizing, then we'd better start now, Brooks said, because hours might be all those men have left. Emily felt the stone in her chest tighten further. Hours. The word rattled around in her mind, colliding with the image of Reynolds' photograph on the screen, with the memory of his hand pulling her free of wreckage that should have killed her, with the sound of gunfire she still heard sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep. Commander, she said, every hour we spend building a case is an hour those soldiers spend running out of ammunition, water, and time. I understand the need for authorization. I understand the weight of what you're being asked to approve. But somewhere on that island, Captain Reynolds is making decisions right now about who gets water first, who gets ammunition first, who might not make it through the night, and none of that waits for a communication window. Brooks looked at her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, from the back of the room, Kim's console let out a soft, urgent chime. Everyone turned. Kim's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, and her face, already tense, tightened further. Commander, she said, we just got a burst transmission from the ground team. Put it up. The message that appeared on the screen was short, clipped, the kind of message soldiers sent when there wasn't time or safety for anything longer. Perimeter breached east flank, 1 KIA, 2 additional wounded, requesting immediate air support, any air support. We are running out of options. The room went completely silent. Emily stared at the screen, at the words that had just turned an abstract, terrifying mission into something with a body count already climbing. 1 KIA, not Reynolds. The message didn't say, it couldn't say. And in the space of that uncertainty, Emily felt something inside her go very still and very focused, the way it always did in the moment right before everything became simple. Not easy, never easy, but simple, reduced down to a single, unbreakable priority. She stood. "Commander," she said, and her voice had changed, had dropped into something quieter and harder. "I need an answer. Now. Not in hours. Now." Brooks looked at the screen. He looked at Kim, whose hands were still on the keyboard, waiting for orders. He looked at Ortiz, whose earlier certainty about the impossibility of the math seemed to have drained out of him entirely, replaced by something more like dread. And then he looked at Emily, standing there with her jaw set and her eyes fixed on him like she already knew what she was going to do regardless of what he said next. "If I say no," Brooks said slowly, "and those men die tonight, I have to live with that decision for the rest of my life. And if you say yes," Emily said, "and I don't make it off this deck, that's on me, not on you. I need you to understand that, Commander. Whatever happens on that runway, it was my choice to make it. All I'm asking you for is the chance." The overhead light buzzed faintly. Somewhere beyond the walls of the briefing room, the ocean moved beneath the ship in its endless, indifferent rhythm, carrying them closer with every passing minute to a decision that could not be delayed much longer. Brooks closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, something in his posture had shifted, had settled, the way a man settles when he finally stops fighting a decision he already knows he's going to make. "Get the deck crew moving," he said quietly. "Full weight reduction protocol on that airframe. I want every non-essential piece of equipment off of that aircraft in the next hour. Clear the entire flight deck. Reposition everything that isn't bolted down." "Commander," Ortiz began. "I heard the numbers, Lieutenant. I heard every word of them. And I'm telling you that in 19 years of service, I have never once regretted trying to save someone, and I am not about to let tonight be the first time." He turned to Kim. "Good word to the Admiral. Inform, don't request. We are proceeding." Kim's fingers moved instantly across her console. Emily felt something loosen in her chest, just slightly, just enough to breathe. "Thank you, Commander," she said quietly. Brooks didn't look at her right away. When he finally did, there was no more mockery in his eyes, no more of the sneering certainty that had greeted her on the flight deck less than an hour earlier. What was there instead was something far more complicated. Respect, mixed with fear, mixed with the particular grief of a man who suspected he might be sending someone to their death and had chosen to do it anyway, because the alternative was worse. "Major," he said, "I still think the math is against you." "I know. I still think there's a real chance you don't make it off this deck." "I know that too." "Then why does it look like you're not afraid?" Emily was quiet for a moment, thinking of Reynolds' hand closing around her arm years ago, pulling her out of fire and smoke while the world around them came apart. "I am afraid, Commander," she said finally. "I've just learned that being afraid and doing the job anyway aren't opposites. They're the same thing most days." Brooks held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, sharp and final. The gesture of a man handing over authority he'd fought hard to keep and was now letting go of because he had to. "Then let's get you ready," he said. "Because if you're going to try something no one's ever done off this ship, I want every single person on this deck doing their job perfectly. No mistakes, no shortcuts. This crew is not going to be the reason you don't make it." Outside, the deck crews were already moving, a sudden storm of motion breaking out across the flight deck as orders rippled outward. Clear the deck, strip the aircraft, check every bolt, every line, every inch of an airframe that had never once been asked to do what it was about to be asked to do. And in the middle of it all, Chief Hayes stood beside the A-10 with a hand resting on its wing, feeling the faint vibration of the ship's engines beneath his boots, and looked up at the sky where, somewhere far beyond the horizon, 14 men were fighting to survive one more hour. "All right, old girl," he murmured, almost to himself. "Let's see if you've got one more impossible flight left in you." Behind him, Emily walked out onto the deck, the wind catching her hair, the ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that aircraft hours earlier, the sailors who had laughed at her fell completely silent. Because whatever they had thought about her plan before, they were no longer looking at a woman about to embarrass herself. They were looking at a woman about to try something that might genuinely be impossible, and for reasons none of them could quite articulate, not one of them doubted anymore that she meant to try it anyway. Somewhere below deck, a clock kept ticking. Somewhere on an island 600 miles away, 13 men and their captain kept fighting, not knowing that help was coming, not knowing what kind of help it would be, not knowing that the woman preparing to risk everything for them once owed her life to the very man now fighting for his. And on the flight deck of the USS Liberty, as the sun began its slow climb toward the middle of the sky, an aircraft that had never been meant to leave that ship sat waiting. Engines silent for now, while a pilot who refused to accept the word impossible walked toward it with a steadiness that made even the most hardened sailors stop and watch. The wind shifted. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the water, low and warning, like the ocean itself understood exactly what was about to be asked of it. The wind did not wait for anyone's permission. It kept building across the flight deck of the USS Liberty, sharp and insistent, tugging at loose gear and snapping the collars of sailors who had already begun tearing the A-10 apart piece by piece under Chief Hayes's shouted instructions. Nobody on that deck was thinking about rank anymore. They were thinking about weight, about seconds, about 14 men on an island who had no idea their rescue depended on how fast a Navy maintenance crew could strip an Air Force jet down to its bones. Ammunition feed system, non-essential rounds. Pull it, Hayes barked, moving along the fuselage with a tablet in one hand and a wrench in the other. Auxiliary fuel tank on the left pylon, gone. I want that thing lighter than it's ever been in its life. Chief, if we pull the auxiliary tank, her range drops by almost 40%, one of the younger mechanics said, hesitating with his hand on the release mechanism. She won't have the loiter time to. She won't get off this deck at all if we don't pull it, Hayes snapped. Range doesn't matter if she never leaves the runway. The mechanic pulled the release without another word. Emily stood a few feet away, watching her aircraft come apart around her, feeling something strange and hollow settle into her stomach. She had flown this exact airframe for 3 years. She knew every rattle in its frame, every quirk in its throttle response, every place where the paint had worn thin from 100 missions that should have ended worse than they did. And now she was watching strangers dismantle it in real time, trading its strength for the thin margin of runway that might let it leave the deck at all. You're doing the math again, Hayes said, appearing at her shoulder without her noticing. I never stopped. And it's still too close for comfort. Hayes wiped his hands on a rag hanging from his belt and looked at the aircraft, now missing panels, missing weapons pylons, missing everything that wasn't bolted directly into its survival. You know, he said, and in 19 years, I've never stripped an aircraft down like this. Not even for combat loadouts. This is somewhere past reckless and into something I don't have a word for yet. Scared enough? Scared enough. Emily allowed herself the smallest, tightest smile. Good. Means we're taking it seriously. Ortiz came jogging across the deck toward them, tablet clutched against his chest, his face carrying the particular tension of a man about to deliver numbers nobody wanted to hear. Major, he said slightly out of breath, I've recalculated with the current weight reduction and this morning's wind readings. And? Better? Not good. Better. He turned the tablet toward her. Takeoff roll is down to approximately 890 feet, assuming we maintain current headwind conditions of 18 knots. The deck is 1,000 feet. The deck is 1,000 feet, Ortiz confirmed, which gives you roughly 110 feet of margin, under ideal conditions. And if conditions aren't ideal? Ortiz didn't answer right away, and that silence told her everything his numbers hadn't. Lieutenant, Emily said quietly, I need you to say it out loud. I can't fly blind into a number nobody's willing to speak. Ortiz exhaled. If wind drops below 15 knots, or if we get any kind of crosswind component above 5 knots, your margin disappears completely. At that point, Major, you're not flying off this deck. You're running out of it. The words landed hard, but Emily had expected them. She'd been running the same calculations in her head since the moment she'd volunteered for this mission, turning them over and over like stones in her pocket, looking for the crack that would let her believe this was survivable instead of merely possible. Then we watch the wind, she said, and we launch the second the numbers are in our favor. Not a minute later and not a minute early. Copy that. Across the deck, Near the island superstructure, a hatch opened and Lieutenant Kim came out at a near run, her face pale beneath the gray morning light. Emily saw her coming and felt the stone in her chest tighten before Kim even reached them. "Major, Commander Brooks needs you in the comms room. Now." "What happened?" "Just come." The urgency in Kim's voice was enough. Emily followed her at a jog, weaving through the controlled chaos of the flight deck, past sailors carrying stripped panels and coiled cable, until they reached the small, cramped comms room where Brooks stood, staring at a screen with his arms crossed and his jaw locked tight. "Commander," Emily said, "talk to me." Brooks didn't turn around right away. When he finally did, his expression was unreadable in a way that frightened her more than open anger would have. "The Admiral's response came in," he said. "It's not a yes." Emily felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though the ship itself hadn't moved. "What is it then?" "It's a conditional maybe, wrapped in enough caution language to cover every Admiral's career for the next decade." Brooks turned the screen toward her. "He wants a full risk assessment signed by myself, by you, and by the ship's flight safety officer before he'll authorize a non-standard launch of this magnitude. He wants confirmation that every alternative has been exhausted, and he wants it documented that this decision was made with full awareness that the aircraft may be lost. That could take hours we don't have." "I know. Commander, those men can't wait for paperwork." "I know that too, Major, but I am not going to authorize this launch without something on record proving that every single person involved understood exactly what we were risking. If this goes wrong, and if you don't walk away from that runway, I'm not going to have it look like this ship acted recklessly on a whim. I owe that to you. I owe it to my crew. And frankly, I owe it to the Navy." Emily stared at him, feeling frustration and something unexpectedly like respect wrestling inside her chest at the same time. "Fine," she said. "Then let's write it fast." For the next several minutes, the comms room became a strange kind of battlefield of its own. Words instead of bullets. Three people racing to put a mission's worth of danger into language precise enough to satisfy an admiral 600 miles removed from the wind currently gusting across the flight deck. Emily dictated risk factors in short, clipped sentences. Brooks added command context. The flight safety officer, a quiet, serious woman named Lieutenant Diaz, who Emily had barely spoken 2 words to before this moment, reviewed every line with a kind of grim thoroughness that made Emily grateful, despite the ticking clock, that someone in this process was being this careful. "Runway margin acceptable only under specific wind parameters," Diaz read aloud as she typed. "Aircraft modified beyond standard operational configuration. Pilot fully briefed and voluntarily assuming known risk of total aircraft loss." She glanced up at Emily. "You're certain you want that last part phrased that way?" "Phrase it exactly like that," Emily said. "I don't want anyone reading this later thinking I didn't understand what I was agreeing to." Diaz nodded once and kept typing. 12 minutes after the Admiral's conditional response had come through, the completed risk assessment went back out across the same channel, carrying 3 signatures and a mission clock that had, by Emily's count, just burned nearly a full hour since the last transmission from the island. "Now we wait," Brooks said. "How long?" "However long it takes him to read 3 pages and decide whether he trusts us." The waiting was its own kind of torment. Emily stood near the small window of the comms room, watching the gray sky churn above the ocean, feeling every second stretch longer than it should have. Somewhere out there, past the horizon, past the reach of anything she could see or touch, Captain Michael Reynolds was fighting to keep his team alive, and every minute she spent standing in this room instead of moving toward that runway felt like a minute stolen from men who didn't have any to spare. "Tell me about him," Kim said quietly, breaking the silence. She'd stayed behind while Brooks stepped out to check on deck preparations, and something in her voice suggested she wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. "Captain Reynolds, you said he saved your life." Emily hesitated, then found somewhat to her own surprise that she wanted to say it out loud. Maybe because the waiting demanded something to film it. Maybe because carrying it silently had become its own kind of weight. 4 years ago, she said, I was flying close support over a valley we'd been told was clear. It wasn't clear. I took a hit to my hydraulics about 90 seconds after entering the area, lost control authority, and went down about 2 miles from a friendly position. She paused, the memory rising with an intensity that surprised her even now. The aircraft came apart on impact. I broke my leg, cracked 2 ribs, and I was pinned partially under the wreckage, with enemy movement closing in from the tree line. And Reynolds? His team was already withdrawing. They'd completed their objective. They were clear. They had every reason in the world to keep moving toward extraction and let a rescue team handle the downed pilot situation through normal channels. Emily's voice tightened slightly. Instead, he turned his entire team around and came back for me, under fire. He personally pulled me out from under that wreckage while two of his men held the tree line, and he carried me over half a mile on a leg that was clearly broken, because he'd made the decision that leaving me behind wasn't something he was willing to live with. Kim was quiet for a moment. That's not standard protocol. No, Emily said, it isn't. It's the kind of thing that gets written up as either heroism or insubordination, depending on how the mission ends. In his case, it ended with me alive and him getting a commendation instead of a reprimand, but I've always known the truth of it. He made a choice that day that had nothing to do with orders and everything to do with who he is as a person. And I've spent 4 years wondering if I'd ever get the chance to make the same kind of choice for him. And now you have. Now I have, Emily said quietly, which is exactly why I can't sit in this room waiting on paperwork while he's out there running out of time. As if summoned by the words themselves, the console beside Kim let out a sharp, urgent tone. Kim spun toward it instantly, fingers moving across the keys, and Emily watched her face change in real time, the color draining from it in a way that made her stomach drop before a single word had been spoken. What is it? Burst transmission, Kim said, voice tight. From the island. Put it up. The message that scrolled across the screen was shorter than the last one, and somehow that brevity made it worse. Second KI, A confirmed. Reynolds wounded. Shrapnel, non-critical but bleeding. Team consolidating to smaller perimeter. Ammunition critical, requesting any available air support immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Emily felt the words hit her like a physical blow. Reynolds wounded. Not critical, the message said, but wounded, bleeding, fighting on a perimeter that had just shrunk again, surrounded by an enemy force that showed no signs of slowing down. Where's Brooks? She said, and her voice had gone sharp, urgent. All patience burned away in an instant. Flight deck. Get him on comms, now. I don't care what the Admiral's paperwork says. I need a launch window in the next 20 minutes or there won't be anyone left on that island to rescue. Kim was already moving, patching the flight deck line through, and a moment later Brooks's voice crackled over the small speaker, tense and clipped. Talk to me. Commander Reynolds is wounded, Emily said, leaning toward the comm unit. Second man KEA. They're consolidating to a smaller perimeter, and they're critical on ammunition. I need to be in that cockpit in the next 20 minutes. There was a pause on the line, and Emily could practically hear Brooks weighing the risk of moving forward without a full Admiral sign-off against the risk of doing nothing while the situation on the ground collapsed further. The Admiral's authorization hasn't come through yet, Brooks said finally. Commander, I understand the position that puts you in, I do. But I am asking you, as the person who is going to be sitting in that cockpit and accepting every ounce of the risk personally, to let me launch under emergency authority. You can document that the decision was made under active combat emergency conditions. That's not a loophole, Commander. That's the truth of what's happening right now. Another pause. Longer this time. Emily closed her eyes, willing him toward the answer she needed, feeling every second of silence stretch like wire pulled too tight. Get to the flight deck, Brooks said finally. I'm invoking emergency combat authority. I'll deal with the Admiral's paperwork after those men are alive to read about it. Relief hit Emily so hard it was almost dizzying, but there wasn't time to feel it fully. She was already moving out of the comms room, down the narrow corridor, back out into the wind and noise of the flight deck, where the A-10 sat waiting, stripped down to something leaner and more urgent than it had been an hour earlier. Hayes met her halfway across the deck, his face tight with a new kind of tension. Major, we've got a problem. Her stomach dropped again. What kind of problem? Nose gear, Hayes said, already walking fast toward the aircraft, forcing her to match his pace. During the weight reduction, one of my guys noticed a hairline stress fracture on the reinforced nose gear strut. Probably been there since before the reinforcement work, but under normal operations, it wouldn't have mattered. Under the kind of stress you're about to put this airframe through. How bad? Bad enough that I can't in good conscience tell you it's safe to fly. Emily stopped walking. For a moment, the entire mission seemed to hang suspended in that single sentence, the wind howling around them, the ocean churning beneath the ship. 14 men, shown now down to 12 with one wounded, waiting on an island that had no idea their rescue had just hit a wall none of them could see. Can you fix it? Not properly. Not in the time we've got. I can reinforce it temporarily, brace it with what we've got on hand, but Major, I want to be straight with you. Hayes's eyes were hard, honest, carrying the weight of 19 years of keeping pilots alive. A temporary brace on a stress fracture in a component that's about to take the entire shock load of a max effort takeoff roll is a gamble. If it holds, you're fine. If it doesn't, that strut fails right as you're accelerating down the deck, and you lose the entire front of the aircraft's structural integrity at the worst possible moment. Emily looked past him, toward the aircraft, toward the sailors still working around it, toward the ocean beyond the bow that seemed, in that moment, to stretch out endlessly in every direction, patient and indifferent to the decision she was about to make. How long to brace it? 15 minutes if we move fast. Move fast. Hayes didn't argue. He turned and started shouting orders, and within seconds, a fresh wave of urgency broke out around the aircraft's nose section, tools flashing, voices overlapping, the entire deck crew throwing themselves into a repair that had, moments earlier, threatened to end the mission before it began. Emily stood a few feet back, watching, feeling the strange, suspended calm that always settled over her in moments like this. Not peace, never quite peace, but something adjacent to it. A stillness born from having already accepted the worst possible outcome and choosing to move forward anyway. Ortiz appeared at her side again, tablet in hand, his expression grim. Wind's shifting, he said quietly. How much? Currently reading 16 knots, down from 18. Directions holding steady for now, but the meteorological officer is flagging a possibility of gusts dropping below 15 within the next half hour. Which means my window is closing. Which means your window is closing, Ortiz confirmed. Major, I have to ask, if the wind drops before Hayes finishes that brace, are you still going to attempt this? Emily didn't answer right away. She watched Hayes and his crew working with a speed that bordered on frantic, watched the deck around her transform second by second from chaos into something that almost resembled readiness, and felt the full weight of the decision pressing down on her chest like a physical thing. I'm going to attempt this, she said finally, because the alternative is watching men die on a screen from 600 miles away and telling myself I did everything I could. And I won't be able to live with that lie, Lieutenant. Not for the rest of my life. Ortiz nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. Not agreement exactly, but a kind of reluctant understanding. For what it's worth, he said, I hope the numbers are wrong about how close this is going to be. So do I. 9 minutes into the repair, Kim came running out onto the deck, breathless, her jacket whipping in the wind. Major, Commander wants you to know the Admiral's authorization just came through. Full approval, retroactive to Brooks's emergency order. Relief flickered through Emily, small and distant compared to the immediate pressure of the moment, but real nonetheless. Good, that's good. There's more, Kim said, and something in her tone made Emily's stomach tighten again. New transmission from the island, 30 seconds ago. They've spotted enemy movement on their southern flank. Reynolds is estimating they have less than an hour before that flank collapses entirely. Less than an hour. Emily looked toward the aircraft, toward Hayes, who was tightening the last bolts on the brace with a focus so total it seemed to blot out everything else around him. Chief, she called. Status! Hayes straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold wind, and gave the brace one final hard inspection. It's not perfect, he said, but it'll hold for a standard takeoff load. Whether it holds for what you're about to put it through, I genuinely don't know, Major. I'm giving you my honest assessment because you deserve that much. This is the best we can do in the time we've got. Emily walked to the aircraft, placed a hand on the reinforced strut, feeling the cold metal beneath her palm, feeling the small human effort of a dozen mechanics who had thrown themselves at an impossible repair because somewhere far away, a man neither of them had ever met was running out of time. It'll hold, she said quietly, more to herself than to Hayes. Major, It'll hold, Chief, because it has to. Hayes studied her for a long moment, and something passed between them that didn't need words. The particular understanding shared by people who had both, in their own ways, given everything they had to a machine and a mission that demanded more than either of them could reasonably promise. Get in the cockpit, he said finally. Wynn's not going to wait for us to feel ready. Emily nodded, turned toward the ladder, and felt the entire deck seem to hold its breath around her. The sailors who had laughed at her mere hours earlier now stood in near total silence, watching her climb, watching the strange, stripped-down aircraft that had become, in the span of a single morning, the only thing standing between 14 men and a fate none of them wanted to imagine. Brooks arrived on the deck just as she reached the top of the ladder, his face set into hard lines, his eyes tracking her every movement with an intensity that hadn't been there when he first saw her that morning. "Major," he called up. She paused, looking down at him. Deck's cleared, winds holding at 15 knots. "Steady, for now. You've got your window, but it's not going to stay open long." "Understood, Commander." "Major." Something in his voice made her pause fully, made her look at him properly, the wind whipping between them, the entire ship seeming to narrow down to just the two of them for a moment. "I was wrong about you this morning. I want you to know that before you go, because if something happens out there, I don't want the last thing you remember from this deck being me calling this insane." Emily felt something tighten in her throat, unexpected and sharp. "It is insane, Commander," she said. "That's never been in question. The only question was whether it was worth it. And ask me when I get back." She settled into the cockpit, and the world outside narrowed into the familiar rhythm of pre-flight checks, muscle memory taking over where fear might otherwise have found room to grow. Systems check, fuel levels, weapon status, reduced but functional. Every gauge, every indicator, every small mechanical confirmation that the aircraft beneath her was as ready as 19 years of Hayes' experience and 40 minutes of frantic effort could make it. Through her headset, she heard Ortiz's voice, tense and precise. "Wind reading 14.5 knots. Direction holding. Major, that's below our safety threshold." Emily's hand hovered over the throttle. 14.5. Half a knob below the number that had, an hour earlier, represented the difference between possible and impossible. "Confirm reading," as she said, a pause. "Confirmed. 14.5, steady for the last 30 seconds. Below her, on the deck, she could see Brooks watching, could see Hayes standing near the island superstructure with his arms crossed, could see the collective held breath of an entire ship's crew who had, against every instinct of caution and protocol, decided to trust her with something that might get her killed. "Commander," she said into the comm, "wind's below threshold." There was a long pause on the other end. When Brooks's voice came back, it carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Your call, Major. I'm not going to make this decision for you." Emily closed her eyes for half a second, feeling the aircraft hum around her, feeling the reinforced strut beneath the nose that Hayes had promised would hold without being able to fully promise it, feeling the image of Reynolds' face from that old photograph pressing against the back of her mind like a hand on her shoulder. Somewhere on that island, a wounded man was fighting to keep his team alive, refusing, she was certain, to give up, because giving up had never been something Michael Reynolds knew how to do. She wasn't going to know how to do it either. "I'm going," she said quietly. "Prepare for launch." Below, she saw Hayes straighten sharply, saw Brooks's jaw tighten, saw the entire deck crew brace, as if the wind itself had just changed direction. "Copy that, Major." Ortiz's voice crackled through, tight with barely restrained tension. "God help us all. You are cleared for takeoff roll on your mark." Emily's hand closed around the throttle. The engines built behind her, a rising howl that seemed to swallow every other sound on the deck, every doubt, every calculation, every warning that had been spoken in that briefing room hours earlier. The deck stretched out ahead of her, shorter than it had ever looked in her entire career, the gray line of the ocean waiting patiently beyond its edge. "Brace positions," Ortiz's voice said, tight and fast. "All personnel, clear the strike zone. I say again, clear the strike zone." Emily's eyes fixed on the horizon, on the thin gray line where deck met sky, where in a few short seconds she would either climb into the air on an aircraft never meant to leave this ship, or run out of steel beneath her wheels with nothing ahead but open water. She thought of Reynolds's hand closing around her arm 4 years ago, pulling her from wreckage that should have killed her. She thought of the message still glowing somewhere on a screen in the comms room. Bleeding, ammunition critical. This is not a drill. She thought of Brooks's voice, rough with something that had stopped being doubt and become, somewhere in the last hour, something closer to faith. Her hand tightened on the throttle. "Here we go," she whispered, and released the brakes. The engine screamed. The deck began to move beneath her. Faster, faster, the reinforced struts shuddering under a load it had never been designed to carry. The ocean rushing toward her at a speed that made the remaining runway feel like it was disappearing in real time. Every sailor on that deck frozen mid-motion. Every eye locked on the aircraft, hurtling toward the edge of the world, with nothing beyond it but sky and water, and the terrible, narrowing distance where impossible was about to become real, or the whole mission was about to end in fire. The nose gear held for exactly 4 seconds longer than Chief Hayes had promised it would, and in the strange, elastic stretch of time that comes right before disaster or deliverance, 4 seconds felt like an entire lifetime unfolding beneath Emily's hands. The aircraft screamed down the deck, faster than anything that heavy had any right to move. The reinforced strut shuddering under a stress load Hayes had openly admitted he couldn't guarantee it would survive. Emily felt every vibration through the frame, through the yoke, through her own spine, cataloging each shudder against the mental map of failure points she'd built in her head during every quiet, terrified minute of preparation. The edge of the deck rushed toward her. "Airspeed!" Ortiz's voice cracked through her headset, no longer calm, no longer procedural, just a man watching numbers climb toward a threshold that might not be reached in time. "Coming up on rotation speed. Wait, Major, you're low on the numbers." "I see it," Emily said, and her voice did not shake, because there was no room left inside her for anything except the next half second and the one after that. The deck ran out beneath her. For one suspended, horrifying instant, the aircraft was neither flying nor rolling, simply falling, nose tilted upward in a desperate plea toward the sky, while beneath it, the gray Pacific opened its arms in patient, indifferent welcome. On the flight deck, 200 sailors stopped breathing at the exact same moment. Brooks's hands closed into fists at his sides. Hayes took an involuntary step forward, as if his own body could somehow reach out and hold the aircraft aloft through sheer will. Kim's fingers hovered frozen over her console. The transmission she'd been about to send abandoned mid-thought. The A-10 dropped below the level of the flight deck. Gone. Vanished from sight as if the ocean had simply reached up and swallowed it whole. Nobody on that deck moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the wind, and beneath it, terribly, the absence of engine noise, where engine noise should have been. "No," Hayes whispered, so quietly that only the sailor beside him heard it. "No, no, no." 3 seconds passed. 3 seconds that felt, to every person standing on that deck, like the longest stretch of silence any of them had ever endured. And then the engines roared back to life, louder than before, defiant, furious, climbing. The A-10 burst back into view below the bow, nose pitched hard upward, gaining altitude in a steep, aggressive climb that seemed to physically punch its way back into the sky it had almost lost. The deck erupted. Sailors who moments earlier had stood frozen in horror now shouted, fists raised, some of them openly weeping with the sudden violent release of tension that had been building in their chests since the moment Emily first stepped onto this ship. Hayes dropped to his knees on the deck, both hands pressed against his face, and when he finally looked up, his cheeks were wet and he didn't bother hiding it. Brooks stood perfectly still amid the chaos, watching the aircraft climb higher and higher into the gray morning sky, and something in his chest, something that had been rigid and certain and unyielding since the moment he'd first seen that A-10 sitting on his deck, finally broke open completely. "She did it," he said, to no one, to everyone. She actually did it. In the cockpit, Emily's hands were steady on the controls even as her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough to hurt. She leveled off, checked her instruments with the mechanical precision of someone whose training had taken over completely where conscious thought could no longer keep pace, and allowed herself exactly one breath, one single shuddering breath, before pushing every ounce of relief aside to make room for what came next. "Liberty, this is Warhawk 1, she said into the comm, her voice rough but level. "I am airborne, repeat, I am airborne, climbing through 2,000 feet, turning to heading 270 for the island. Status of nose gear strut is unknown, no unusual vibration detected in flight. Will monitor." There was a pause on the other end, and when Ortiz's voice came back, it cracked with something that hadn't been in it before. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the beginning of it. "Copy that, Warhawk 1, copy that." Another pause, longer, and Emily could hear faintly the sound of cheering in the background. Sailors' voices raised in something close to disbelief. "Major, that was the single most insane thing I have ever seen an aircraft do, and I have been on this ship 11 years. "Save the commentary for the debrief, Lieutenant," Emily said, but there was no real edge to it. "I've got 12 men still waiting on me." "Copy, understood. Godspeed, Major." The line went quiet and Emily was alone with the aircraft, the wind, and 600 miles of open ocean stretching out ahead of her toward the island, where everything that mattered was still, desperately, hanging in the balance. She checked her fuel, checked her weapons status, checked the makeshift brace on the nose gear one more time through the aircraft's diagnostic display, watching for any hint of the vibration that would tell her Hayes's warning had been more prophecy than precaution. Nothing. For now, nothing. The brace was holding. 4 minutes into the flight, the adrenaline of the launch began to recede, and in its place came something colder and more focused, the particular clarity that settled into Emily's mind whenever a mission moved from theoretical danger into something closer, something with a clock actively running out. She thought of the message still burning in her memory. "Reynolds wounded. Second man KIA. Ammunition critical. This is not a drill." She pushed the throttle forward another notch, watching her airspeed climb, feeling the engines respond with a steady, powerful thrum that seemed, for the first time all morning, like an act of solidarity rather than risk. "Hang on," she said quietly, to a man 600 miles away who couldn't hear her, who didn't know she was coming, who had no reason to believe that help was anything more than a fading hope. "I'm coming, just hang on a little longer." 9 minutes into the flight, her radio crackled with a transmission that made her blood run cold. "Warhawk 1, this is Overwatch. Be advised, we're picking up radar contact on your 6, unidentified aircraft. Bearing 090, closing fast." Emily's eyes snapped to her instruments. "Overwatch, Warhawk 1. Say again, unidentified contact?" "Confirmed, Major. Whatever it is, it wasn't there 30 seconds ago, and it's closing on your position at high speed." Every instinct in her body went taut. An aircraft she'd never accounted for, appearing from nowhere, closing on a stripped-down A-10 with reduced weapons and a compromised nose gear, was very possibly the single worst variable that could exist in this mission right now. "Overwatch, can you identify?" A pause filled with a particular static tension of people scrambling for information they didn't yet have. "Negative ID at this time, Major. Radar signature is inconsistent with known enemy aircraft in this theater, but it's definitely not one of ours either. Recommend evasive." The contact resolved itself before Overwatch could finish the sentence, and Emily's tension cracked open into something between relief and disbelief as her own radar display finally painted a clear picture. "Overwatch, belay that," she said, a short, sharp laugh escaping despite herself. "Contact is a civilian cargo aircraft, off course, likely diverted around weather. Repeat, it's a cargo plane, not hostile." There was a long pause on the other end, and then Ortiz's voice, sheepish. "Copy that, Warhawk 1. Sorry for the scare." "No apology necessary, Lieutenant. Better a false alarm than a real one." Emily exhaled, feeling her pulse slowly climb back down from where it had spiked. "Though I'll admit, my heart didn't love that particular update." "Understood. Continuing to monitor, Warhawk 1. You are cleared to proceed." She adjusted her heading slightly, correcting for the small deviation the scare had cost her, and pressed on, the ocean sliding by beneath her in an endless gray sheet, broken only occasionally by the white crest of a wave or the dark shadow of a passing cloud. 12 minutes into the flight, a new transmission came through, and this one carried none of the earlier false alarms relief. "Warhawk 1, this is Overwatch. We've got a burst transmission incoming from the ground team. Patching it through now. Emily's whole body tensed. Copy. Patch it through. The voice that crackled into her headset was rough, strained, breathing hard between words in a way that told her more about the situation than the words themselves ever could. This is Reynolds. Anyone receiving? Please respond. We are down to critical ammunition, multiple wounded, southern flank compromised. Requesting immediate. The transmission cut out, dissolving into static. Emily's hand tightened so hard on the yoke that her knuckles went white. Reynolds, she said into the comm, though she knew he couldn't hear her, though the transmission was one way and already gone. Reynolds, I'm coming. Do you hear me? I'm coming. 14 minutes into the flight, the island appeared on the horizon. It looked from this distance deceptively peaceful. A dark green smudge against the gray ocean, ringed with white surf, utterly indifferent to the battle raging somewhere within its jungle canopy. Emily felt something in her chest tighten at the sight of it, the way it always did in the last moments before a mission became real instead of theoretical. Overwatch, Warhawk 1, I have visual on the island. Beginning descent. Copy, Warhawk 1. Be advised, last confirmed enemy position estimate places hostile forces in a rough perimeter around grid coordinates you should have loaded. Ground team's last known location was inside that perimeter, southern edge. But that was 11 minutes ago and things may have changed. Understood. Descending to engagement altitude now. Emily pushed the nose down, feeling the aircraft respond with the low, controlled aggression it had been built for, dropping through the cloud layer until the island's details began to resolve beneath her. The dense green canopy, the thin gray scar of the clearing she remembered from the satellite images. And as she banked lower, the first unmistakable signs of the battle she was flying into. Muzzle flashes, small and distant, flickering like fireflies through gaps in the jungle canopy. Smoke, rising in 3 distinct plumes from what she guessed were destroyed vehicles or equipment caches. And then, as she banked further, she saw them. A tight cluster of human shapes near the center of the clearing. Hunkered low, some clearly wounded, all of them locked in a defensive formation that told her everything she needed to know about how close to breaking they truly were. Overwatch, Warhawk 1, I have visual on the friendly position. They are in serious trouble. Copy, Warhawk 1, you are cleared hot. Danger close is authorized given the situation. Godspeed. Emily's training took over completely. The last vestiges of fear and doubt burning away in the face of pure, focused purpose. She banked the A-10 into a low, fast pass along the tree line where the muzzle flashes were concentrated, her thumb finding the trigger for the aircraft's cannon with the ease of 1,000 hours of practice. The GAU-8 opened fire. The sound of it, even from inside the cockpit, was staggering. A deep, tearing roar unlike anything else in the sky, the kind of sound that didn't just announce the aircraft's presence, but seemed to physically reshape the battlefield around it. Below her, the tree line where enemy fire had been concentrated erupted in a storm of impacts. And for the first time in over 30 hours, the volume of incoming fire toward the American position dropped sharply. On the ground, Captain Michael Reynolds pressed himself against a shattered log, blood soaking through the hastily wrapped bandage on his shoulder, and heard a sound he hadn't dared to hope for. He turned to the soldier beside him, a young corporal named Danny Ruiz, whose face was streaked with dirt and exhaustion. Ruiz, tell me you heard that too. I heard it, sir. Ruiz's voice cracked with something between disbelief and desperate hope. That's a GAU-8. That's an A-10. There's no A-10 assets in this theater, Reynolds said, even as the aircraft banked overhead, its distinctive twin-tail silhouette cutting across the gray sky like something out of a dream he didn't trust himself to believe in. Command told us nothing was available. Well, somebody didn't get the memo, sir, because that thing just turned the north tree line into scrap metal. Reynolds watched the aircraft climb, bank, and come around for another pass, and something in his chest, something that had been holding on by pure stubborn will for the last 31 hours, allowed itself just slightly to hope. Get the radio, he said. Whoever that is, I want contact, now. In the cockpit, Emily's headset crackled with a new voice, ragged with static and exhaustion, but unmistakably, achingly familiar, even after 4 years of separation. Unknown aircraft, unknown aircraft. This is Ghost 6 Actual, requesting immediate identification. Over. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Ghost 6, Reynolds' call sign. She would have recognized it anywhere in any static after any amount of time. Ghost 6, she said, her voice unsteady for the first time since she'd climbed into the cockpit. This is Warhawk 1. Good to hear your voice, Captain. There was a long pause on the other end, filled with nothing but the hiss of open static, and Emily could picture him exactly, jaw tight, eyes narrowed, trying to place a voice that had haunted the edges of his memory for 4 years, the same way his had haunted hers. Warhawk 1, Reynolds said slowly, disbelief bleeding through every syllable. Say your call sign again, and your name. It's Carter, Emily said. Emily Carter. I believe you owe me a rescue, Captain, and I intend to collect. The silence that followed was longer this time, heavier, and when Reynolds' voice came back, it had cracked open completely, stripped of every ounce of the exhausted defensive control he'd been holding onto for over a day straight. Emily, he said, and it wasn't a captain's voice anymore. It was just a man's voice, raw with disbelief and something achingly close to grief-stricken relief. Emily, is that? How the hell are you flying an A-10 out here? There's no carrier assets rated for... It's a long story, Captain, and I promise to tell you every ridiculous detail of it once we get you and your men out of that clearing. Right now, I need you to give me your exact position relative to the tree line and tell me where the heaviest enemy concentration is. The shift in his voice was immediate, 4 years of training snapping back into place even through the shock. Southern flank, 50 meters from our position, heavy concentration. That's where we lost Simmons and where Doc Whitfield's been holding a triage line under fire for the last 20 minutes. If you can suppress that flank, we might actually have a chance to consolidate. Copy that, Ghost 6. Marking your southern flank now. Keep your heads down. This is going to get loud. Emily banked the aircraft hard, lining up her run along the southern edge of the clearing where Reynolds had indicated, and felt something settle inside her. Not calm exactly, but a kind of fierce, focused clarity that pushed every last trace of doubt out of her mind entirely. The cannon opened up again, tearing through the tree line with a violence that sent enemy fighters scattering in every direction. And below, in the chaos of the clearing, Reynolds watched the southern flank's incoming fire drop from a steady, relentless barrage to something sporadic and disorganized. She's doing it, Ruiz said, disbelief written across every line of his exhausted face. Sir, she's actually pushing them back. I know, Reynolds said quietly, watching the aircraft bank for another pass, feeling something in his chest that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in over a day. I know exactly what she's doing. 19 minutes into her time over the island, Emily's radio crackled with a new voice. Overwatch back on the line, carrying information that shifted the entire shape of the mission once again. Warhawk 1, be advised, thermal imaging is picking up additional enemy movement approaching from the eastern ridge, estimated company strength, ETA to friendly position, approximately 8 minutes. Emily's jaw tightened. Copy, Overwatch, understood. She switched frequencies. Ghost 6, be advised, you've got reinforcements inbound from the east, company strength, 8 minutes out. Reynolds' response came back fast, tight with tension. Copy that, Warhawk 1. We do not have the ammunition to survive a company strength assault, not even close. What's our extraction status? Emily felt the weight of the questions settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. Extraction, helicopters, something that, as far as she knew, hadn't even been formally requested yet, buried somewhere in the chain of communication that had been consumed entirely by the question of whether she could even get airborne in the first place. Working on it, Ghost 6, she said, and switched frequencies again before he could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Overwatch, Warhawk 1, I need extraction assets moving toward this position immediately. Ground team cannot survive a company strength assault without evacuation. There was a pause, and when Ortiz's voice came back, it carried an edge of frustration that told Emily the answer before he even said it. Warhawk 1, be advised, extraction helicopters are currently 40 minutes out from this position. They launched from Liberty as soon as your takeoff was confirmed successful. But 40 minutes is 40 minutes. There's no way to compress that timeline. 40 minutes against a company strength force that would arrive in 8. Emily felt something cold settle into her stomach, The particular dread of watching two numbers collide in a way that left almost no room for survival. Go 6, she said, forcing her voice to stay level. Extraction is 40 minutes out. I need you to hold that long. The silence on the other end stretched just a beat too long before Reynolds answered. 40 minutes, he repeated, and Emily could hear him doing the same grim math she'd just done, weighing ammunition against time, against a reinforcement column that would arrive with enough force to overwhelm what remained of his critically wounded, ammunition-starved team in a matter of minutes, not the better part of an hour. Warhawk 1, I'm not going to lie to you, 40 minutes against company strength with what we've got left is not survivable math. Then we change the math, Emily said, and something in her voice hardened into a resolve that hadn't fully existed until that exact moment. I'm not leaving this airspace, Ghost 6, not until those helicopters are on the ground and every one of your men is aboard. Warhawk 1, your fuel reserves are my problem to manage, Captain, not yours. Your problem is keeping your men alive for the next 8 minutes until that column arrives and then keeping them alive after that. Let me handle the rest. There was another pause, shorter this time, and when Reynolds spoke again, his voice carried something that hadn't been there in years. Not since a night in a burning valley when he'd made a choice that had nothing to do with orders. Copy that, Warhawk 1, he said. We'll hold. Just, Emily, don't do anything stupid up there. Despite everything, the fear, the tension, the impossible math stacking up around her, Emily felt the corner of her mouth pull into something almost like a smile. Says the man who carried me half a mile on a broken leg, she said. I think we're well past the point of avoiding stupid, Captain. I'm just trying to make sure it's the right kind. She banked the aircraft into a wide holding pattern above the clearing. Eyes scanning the tree line, weapons ready, fuel gauge ticking downward with a steadiness that felt, in that moment, like the loudest sound in the entire cockpit. 23 minutes into her time over the island, the eastern tree line began to move. It started subtly, a shifting in the canopy, a ripple of motion that could have been wind if wind moved in straight, disciplined lines, wireless lines. But Emily had flown enough of these missions to recognize the signature of organized troop movement even through dense jungle cover. And her stomach tightened as the numbers Overwatch had given her began terribly to prove themselves inaccurate. Ghost 6, I have visual on your eastern approach. Confirming company strength movement, they are closing. Copy, Warhawk 1, we see it too. Reynolds' voice was tight, controlled, the voice of a man rationing his fear the same way his team was rationing their ammunition. Requesting immediate suppression. Copy that, engaging now. Emily rolled the aircraft into a steep dive, lining up along the tree line where the movement was thickest, and opened fire with the cannon in a long, sustained burst that tore through jungle canopy and enemy formation alike. Below, the advancing column scattered, some fighters falling, others diving for cover. The entire organized momentum of the assault fracturing under the sheer, overwhelming violence of the A-10's cannon fire. But even as she pulled up out of the dive, banking hard to bring the aircraft back around for another pass, Emily felt something change in the response coming from below. A shift in the pattern of return fire. More coordinated now, more concentrated, as if someone on the ground had identified exactly where the danger was coming from and had begun directing fire specifically upward toward her. The first hit came without warning. A sharp, jarring impact against the aircraft's underside, followed by a sudden, ugly shudder that ran through the entire airframe like a shockwave. Warhawk 1, you're hit! Ortiz's voice cracked through her headset, alarm bleeding through every word. We're reading a hit on your airframe. Confirm status. Emily's hands moved across her instruments fast, scanning for damage, feeling her heart rate spike as she registered the first flickering warning light on her display. Not critical, not yet, but not nothing either. Copy, Overwatch, taking fire, minor damage to the tail section, all systems still nominal. She banked hard, pulling the aircraft into a tighter turn to throw off whatever gunner had managed to land that hit. Continuing engagement. Below, Reynolds heard the exchange over the radio and felt his jaw tighten with a fresh wave of fear that had nothing to do with his own wounds and everything to do with the woman circling above him, absorbing fire meant for men on the ground. Warhawk 1, he said, his voice sharp with something close to command, even though she wasn't under his authority. If you're taking damage, you need to consider disengaging. Negative Go 6, Emily said, banking back into position for another pass. Not until that column breaks or those helicopters land, whichever comes first. Emily, I'm not leaving you again, Michael. The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them, raw and unguarded in a way that surprised even her. Not after last time, not when I finally have the chance to be the one who doesn't walk away. The silence on the other end lasted only a second, but it carried the weight of 4 years compressed into a single breath. Copy that, Reynolds said finally, his voice rough. Then make it count up there. Emily lined up for another pass, the tree line ahead of her churning with the chaos of a fractured assault force trying desperately to regroup, and pushed every last shred of fear down into the same place she'd been burying it since the moment she'd first stepped onto that flight deck. 28 minutes into her time over the island, a second warning light flared on her display, this one accompanied by a low, steady vibration that hadn't been there moments before. Emily's stomach dropped. She glanced down at the display, reading the data with a speed born of pure necessity, and felt something cold settle into her chest as the information resolved into a picture she didn't want to see. Fuel line damaged, not severed, not yet, but compromised in a way that was already steadily bleeding away reserves she couldn't afford to lose. Overwatch, she said, keeping her voice level through sheer force of will. Warhawk 1 reporting fuel line damage, unclear extent, monitoring consumption rate. There was a pause, and when Ortiz's voice came back, it carried a tension that told her he understood exactly how serious this could become. Copy, Warhawk 1. What's your current estimate on remaining flight time? Emily ran the numbers fast, cross-referencing her fuel gauge against the new faster consumption rate the damaged line was causing, and felt the answer settle into her chest like a stone. Estimate 22 minutes of flight time remaining, she said. Maybe less if the damage worsens. 22 minutes, against helicopters that were still, by Ortiz's last update, more than 30 minutes out. The math, which had already been impossibly thin, had just collapsed into something far more dangerous. And Emily felt the full weight of that collapse settle over her, even as she banked the aircraft back toward the tree line, toward the men who were still, desperately, counting on her to hold the sky above them for longer than her own aircraft might now allow. Below, unaware of the new crisis unfolding in the cockpit above him, Reynolds pressed a fresh bandage against his shoulder wound. Watching the A-10 climb and bank and dive with a kind of ferocious, protective grace that made something in his chest ache with a gratitude too large for words. Doc, he said quietly to the medic crouched beside him, how's Sanchez holding up? Stable for now, Captain, but he needs a real hospital, not a field dressing. Same with Torres. Get me a status count. Everyone. I want to know exactly what we're working with. As the medic moved off to comply, Reynolds looked up one more time at the sky, at the aircraft that had appeared like something out of a story he wouldn't have believed if he hadn't watched it happen with his own eyes, and felt a fresh wave of dread work its way through his chest. Because even from the ground, even through the smoke, in the cow, in the desperate, grinding fight for survival, he could hear it now. A subtle wrong note in the engine sound above him. A faint stutter that hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier. Ruiz, he said sharply, do you hear that? Ruiz tilted his head, listening, and his face went pale. Sir, that doesn't sound good. Above them in the cockpit, Emily felt the aircraft shudder again. Harder this time, and watched a third warning light bloom red across her display, and understood, with a clarity that settled cold and absolute into her chest, that the airplane beneath her, already pushed past every limit it had ever been designed for, was beginning for the first time since she'd left that flight deck to run out of ways to keep fighting. Overwatch, she said, forcing her voice to stay steady even as her hands tightened on the controls. Warhawk 1 is showing additional system degradation. I need an updated ETA on those helicopters, and I need it now. The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a few seconds, but it felt to Emily like the longest silence of the entire mission. Warhawk 1 ETA on extraction birds is now confirmed at 26 minutes. Ortiz's voice came back, tight and clipped. I need you to understand something, Major. That's the fastest those helicopters can physically fly. There's no more time to shave off that number. 26 minutes. Emily's own aircraft, bleeding fuel through a compromised line, showing 3 separate warning lights across her display, had maybe 22 minutes left in it if the damage held steady. If it didn't hold steady, that number could collapse to nothing in an instant. The math didn't work. She'd known it wouldn't the moment Ortiz's voice had gone quiet on the other end of the line, and now she had actual numbers to confirm what her gut had already told her. "Copy that, Overwatch," she said, and forced herself to sound calmer than she felt. "Understood." Below her, the tree line was still churning with movement, the fractured remains of the company's strength assault regrouping with a discipline that told her these weren't disorganized fighters. They were soldiers, trained ones, adapting fast to the presence of an aircraft that had already cost them dearly. "Ghost 6, she said, switching frequencies. "I need a status update. How are you holding?" Reynolds' voice came back rough, breathless, carrying the particular strain of a man conserving every ounce of energy for what mattered most. "Ammunition's critical across the board, Warhawk 1. We've got maybe 15-20 minutes of sustained defense left if that eastern element pushes hard. Less if they bring anything heavier than small arms." "Copy. Extraction is 26 minutes out." There was a pause, and Emily could hear, even through the static, the exact moment the math hit him the same way it had hit her. "That's not going to work, Warhawk 1, Reynolds said, his voice flat, stripped of anything except grim calculation. "You're telling me we need to survive 26 minutes with 15 to 20 minutes of ammunition?" "I'm telling you I'm not going anywhere until those birds are on the ground," Emily said. "Whatever gap exists between your ammunition and their arrival, I intend to fill it. Emily, your aircraft is damaged. I heard it. Everyone down here heard it." "My aircraft is still flying, Captain. And as long as it's flying, it's doing its job." She banked hard, lining up for another pass along the eastern tree line where the assault force had begun regrouping. "Keep your head down. This is about to get loud again." She didn't wait for his response. She pushed the nose down, brought the cannon to bear, and opened fire in a long, sustained burst that tore through the regrouping formation with a violence that sent bodies and debris scattering through the smoke-hazed canopy below. The impact on her own aircraft came almost immediately after, a jarring shudder that ran through the frame, sharper and more violent than anything she'd felt before, accompanied by a grinding mechanical sound that made her stomach drop before her instruments even confirmed what she already suspected. "Warhawk 1, we're reading a significant impact on your airframe." Ortiz's voice cracked through, alarm bleeding through every syllable. "Confirm status. Confirm status now." Emily's eyes swept across her display, cataloging the damage with the same cold, focused precision that had carried her through every crisis of the last hour. A fourth warning light, hydraulic pressure dropping, not critical yet, not yet. "Overwatch, Warhawk 1, taking additional damage, hydraulic system showing pressure loss, compensating manually." She fought the controls, feeling the aircraft respond with a new sluggishness that hadn't been there moments before, like an old friend suddenly favoring an injured limb. "Still flying, still in the fight." "Major, at what point do you disengage?" Ortiz's voice had lost its professional edge entirely now, replaced by something raw, something closer to fear for her specifically rather than concern for the mission. "Because from where I'm sitting, the numbers are telling me you're running out of aircraft before you run out of enemy." Emily didn't answer right away. She banked the A-10 back around, watching the tree line below her, watching the smoke and chaos of a battle that had somehow become the entire world for everyone involved in it. "I disengage," she said finally, "when those helicopters have every one of those men aboard, or when this aircraft physically cannot fly anymore. Not before." She switched frequencies before Ortiz could argue. "Ghost 6, status on the eastern element?" "Push back again," Reynolds said, and there was something in his voice now, something that hadn't been there in the earlier transmissions, a kind of desperate, disbelieving hope that he seemed to be fighting against, as if he didn't trust himself to feel it fully. "You bought us time, Warhawk 1. I don't know how much, but you bought us time. Then let's keep buying it." 31 minutes into her time over the island, the second fuel warning bloomed across Emily's display, and this time it wasn't ambiguous. Critical fuel state, the kind of warning that didn't leave room for interpretation or optimistic math. Emily stared at it for exactly 1 second, feeling something in her chest tighten into a hard, cold knot, and then pushed it aside because there was nothing to be done about it except keep flying for as long as the aircraft would let her. Overwatch, she said, keeping her voice level through sheer force of will. Warhawk 1 reporting critical fuel state, requesting updated ETA on extraction. 19 minutes, Warhawk 1. A pause. Major, your fuel state. How long can you hold? Emily looked at the gauge, did the math one more time, and felt the answer settle into her stomach like a stone dropped into deep water. Estimate 10 to 12 minutes of flight time remaining, she said, possibly less. The silence on the other end of the radio stretched long enough that Emily wondered, for a moment, if the transmission had failed entirely. Copy that, Warhawk 1, Ortiz said finally, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that told her he understood exactly what those numbers meant. 10 to 12 minutes against a 19-minute extraction window. A gap of 7 to 9 minutes where the sky above those soldiers would have nothing in it at all. Ghost 6, Emily said, switching frequencies, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. I need to be honest with you about something. Go ahead, Warhawk 1. My fuel state is critical. I've got maybe 10, 12 minutes of flight time left. Extraction is 19 minutes out. She banked the aircraft, scanning the tree line, buying herself a few extra seconds before she had to say the rest of it. There's going to be a gap, Captain, a window where I won't be able to cover you. The silence that followed was heavy, and when Reynolds spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Emily's throat tighten. How big a gap? 7 to 9 minutes, maybe more if the damage worsens faster than I'm estimating. Copy that. Reynolds' voice was tight, controlled, the voice of a man doing the only thing he knew how to do in the face of impossible math, planning around it instead of collapsing beneath it. We'll consolidate tighter, ration what ammunition we've got left, and hold as best we can. Emily, his voice caught, just slightly, just enough that she heard it even through the static. You've already done more than anyone had any right to ask of you. If you need to bank out now, disengage while you've still got fuel to make it back toward Liberty. Nobody down here is going to blame you for that. I'm not banking out, Captain. Emily, I said I'm not leaving you again, and I meant it. Her voice hardened, cutting through whatever protest he'd been about to raise. I'm going to stay on station as long as this aircraft will let me, and when it won't let me anymore, I'll figure out the next part then. But I am not leaving this airspace while you're still down there fighting. There was a pause, and when Reynolds spoke again, his voice had changed, had softened into something that sounded almost like the man she remembered from 4 years ago, before all the ranks and call signs and radio discipline, back when he'd simply been someone who refused to leave another person behind. Then make every one of those 10 minutes count, he said. Because I intend to make sure this isn't the last time I hear your voice, Emily Carter. Copy that, Ghost 6. She felt something tighten in her throat, fierce and unexpected, and pushed it down where it wouldn't interfere with what came next. Warhawk 1, out! She banked the aircraft back toward the tree line, watching for movement, watching for muzzle flashes, watching for anything that might threaten the men below her in the narrowing window of time she had left to protect them. 34 minutes into her time over the island, movement flared along the northern edge of the clearing, a smaller element, clearly trying to flank around while the main assault force regrouped to the east. Ghost 6, I've got movement on your north side. Looks like an attempt to flank while your main threat regroups. Copy. We see them. Small element, maybe 6 to 8 fighters. I'm on it. Emily banked hard, lining up along the northern edge, and opened fire in a short, precise burst that scattered the flanking Elisma before it could gain any real ground. But even as she pulled up out of the pass, she felt the aircraft respond with a new, alarming sluggishness. The hydraulic degradation from earlier now compounding with something else. Something in the control surfaces that made the yoke feel heavier, less responsive. Like the aircraft itself was slowly, steadily running out of the strength it needed to keep fighting. A fifth warning light bloomed across her display. Emily's stomach dropped as she read it. Engine 1, temperature rising. Not critical yet, but climbing. Overwatch, she said, and for the first time since launch, her voice carried an edge of something close to fear. Warhawk 1 reporting engine 1, temperature rising. Monitoring closely. Copy, Warhawk 1. Major, I have to ask, are you still combat effective? Emily looked at her instruments, at the constellation of warning lights now spread across her display like a map of everything wrong with the aircraft she was flying, and felt the full weight of the question settle onto her shoulders. "Combat effective for now," she said. "I'll let you know the moment that changes." She banked back toward the tree line, scanning for threats, and found herself thinking, unbidden, of Chief Hayes standing on the deck of the Liberty hours earlier, hands running along the aircraft's hull, feeling for weaknesses he couldn't fully diagnose in the time they'd had. She hoped fiercely that wherever he was right now, he wasn't watching a live feed of exactly how right his fears had been. 38 minutes into her time over the island, the Eastern Assault Force made its move. It came fast, faster than Emily had anticipated, a coordinated push that broke from the tree line in a wide arc, clearly designed to overwhelm the perimeter through sheer numbers before the defenders could bring what remained of their dwindling ammunition to bear. "Go 6, they're pushing. They're pushing. Now, do you see it?" "We see it." Reynolds' voice had lost all pretense of calm control, raw urgency bleeding through every word. "We do not have the ammunition to stop this, Warhawk 1. I need everything you've got, right now." Emily didn't hesitate. She rolled the aircraft into the steepest dive she'd attempted all day, bringing the cannon to bear on the advancing line with a precision born of pure desperate necessity, and opened fire in a sustained burst that tore through the assault formation with devastating effect. Below, Reynolds watched the advancing line shatter under the weight of the A-10's cannon fire, watched fighters scatter and fall and retreat in a chaotic, broken wave, and felt something in his chest that he didn't have words for yet. Something too large and too raw to name in the middle of a battle that had, just moments ago, seemed unwinnable. "She broke them," Ruiz said beside him, disbelief and something like awe warring across his exhausted face. "Captain, she actually broke the assault." "I know," Reynolds said, watching the aircraft pull up out of its dive, and felt his throat tighten at the visible strain in its climb, the way it seemed to labor upward instead of soaring the way it had earlier in the fight. "I know exactly what she did, and I know exactly what it's costing her to do it." In the cockpit, Emily fought to level the aircraft out of the dive, feeling every degree of strain in the controls, feeling the engine temperature warning intensify from a steady amber to something closer to red, feeling the entire airframe protest against demands it had been pushed past its limits to meet. A sixth warning light joined the others. Structural stress, elevated. The nose gear strut. Hayes's warning finally, terribly, proving itself true under exactly the kind of load he'd feared it might not survive. "Overwatch," Emily said, and this time she couldn't fully keep the strain out of her voice. "Warhawk 1 reporting structural stress warning on the nose gear assembly. I need that extraction, TA, now." 14 minutes, Warhawk 1. A pause, tense and heavy. "Major, your fuel state?" "I know my fuel state, Lieutenant." Emily's voice was sharp, not with anger, but with the particular focus of someone holding too many crises at once and refusing to let any of them break her concentration. "I'm not disengaging. Keep those birds moving." She banked the aircraft back toward the clearing, watching the shattered remains of the Eastern Assault Force regroup at a distance, no longer pressing forward with the same coordinated aggression, and felt something like grim satisfaction cut through the mounting fear. They were breaking, slowly, painfully, but breaking. 41 minutes into her time over the island, Reynolds' voice came back over the radio, tighter than before, carrying news that made Emily's chest tighten with fresh dread. "Warhawk 1, be advised, we're seeing new movement. Looks like they've brought something heavier up from the rear. I'm reading what might be a mounted weapon, possibly anti-air capable." Emily's blood ran cold. "Confirm position." "Grid coordinates coming through now. It's set up roughly 400 meters south of our position, partially concealed in the tree line. An anti-air weapon. On an aircraft already bleeding fuel, already shedding hydraulic pressure, already carrying a compromised nose gear strut, and an engine running hotter than it should have been." Emily felt the full, terrible weight of the new threat settle onto everything else she was already managing, and understood, with cold clarity, that this single addition to the battlefield might be the thing that finally ended the mission, one way or another. "Copy, go 6, I see it." She banked toward the position Reynolds had indicated, watching the tree line resolve into the shape of a mounted weapon, hastily camouflaged but unmistakable once she knew where to look. Engaging now. Warhawk 1, that position is capable of bringing you down, Reynolds said, urgency sharpening every word. If you go in low on that target, you're exposing yourself to direct fire from a weapon built to do exactly that. I'm aware, Captain. Emily, there is no version of this mission where that weapon stays operational while your men are still on the ground, Emily said, and her voice had gone hard and flat, stripped of everything except absolute resolve. I'm taking it out. She lined up her approach, watching the weapon position grow larger in her targeting display, feeling every instinct in her body scream at her to pull up, to bank away, to preserve what remained of an aircraft that had already given more than anyone had any right to ask of it. She didn't pull up. The cannon opened fire in the same instant. Tracers began climbing up toward her from the ground, the two streams of violence crossing in the narrow space between the aircraft and the earth. And for one suspended, terrible moment, Emily didn't know which would reach its target first. Her rounds found the weapon position a fraction of a second before its return fire found her. The explosion below was immediate and total, the mounted weapon and the position around it erupting in a violent burst of fire and smoke that told her, without needing confirmation from anyone, that the threat was gone. But the aircraft shuddered violently around her at the exact same moment, a hard, jarring impact that threw her forward against her restraints. And the world outside her cockpit tilted at an angle that told her something had gone seriously, catastrophically wrong. Warhawk 1, you're hit, Ortiz's voice screamed through her headset, all professional composure gone entirely. Confirm status, Major. Confirm status now. Emily fought the controls, her hands moving on pure muscle memory, as her mind raced to catch up with what her instruments were telling her. A seventh warning light, this one glaring red instead of amber. Structural integrity, critical. Right wing. Overwatch, she said, and her voice shook now, couldn't help but shake. Warhawk 1 took a hit, confirming damage to the right wing structure, fighting for control. Below, Reynolds heard the exchange over the radio and felt something close to panic claw up through his chest, sharper and more consuming than anything the ground assault had made him feel. Emily! He was on his feet before he'd fully registered the decision to stand, ignoring the pain screaming through his wounded shoulder, staring up at the sky where smoke now trailed visibly from the aircraft that had spent the last 40 minutes protecting his life and the lives of every man under his command. Emily, talk to me. What's your status? There was a pause, too long, far too long, before her voice crackled back through the radio, tighter now, strained, but unmistakably alive. Still flying, she said. Still flying, Captain. It's not pretty, but I'm still in the air. Relief hit Reynolds so hard that his knees nearly buckled, but he didn't let himself fully feel it, because the fight wasn't over, and the aircraft protecting his team was clearly, audibly struggling to stay airborne. Warhawk 1, Ortiz's voice cut back in, tight with barely restrained urgency. What's your assessment? Can you maintain station? Emily looked at her instruments. The constellation of warning lights now nearly complete across her display, the engine temperature climbing steadily toward a red line she didn't want to cross, the fuel gauge sitting in territory that had stopped being merely critical and become something closer to desperate, and felt the full weight of the decision pressing down on her. I can maintain station for a few more minutes, she said. Maybe 5, maybe less. Extraction is 11 minutes out, Major. 5 minutes of coverage, 11 minutes of gap before the helicopters arrived. A 6-minute window where the sky above Reynolds and his men would have nothing in it at all, right after they'd just survived the largest coordinated assault of the entire engagement. Emily closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, feeling the aircraft shudder around her, feeling the strain in every system fighting to keep her airborne, and made a decision that had nothing to do with the numbers on her display and everything to do with the man whose voice was still faintly audible on the radio below her. Go 6, she said. I'm staying until those birds are within visual range, however long that takes. Warhawk 1, your aircraft, is still flying, Captain, and as long as it's flying, I'm not leaving you exposed. She banked the aircraft in a slow, careful arc, conserving whatever strength remained in the airframe, while keeping herself positioned above the clearing. That's not a debate. That's a decision I already made. 45 minutes into her time over the island, the aircraft's struggles compounded further. A new vibration joining the chorus of mechanical distress running through the frame, and Emily found herself fighting the controls with both hands now, wrestling an aircraft that seemed to want, more and more with every passing second, simply to stop. Overwatch Warhawk 1, I'm losing responsiveness in my control surfaces. Fighting to maintain altitude. Copy. Warhawk 1. Extraction birds are visual range in approximately 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Emily looked at her instruments, at the warning lights that had multiplied beyond anything she'd trained for, at an engine temperature that had finally crossed into territory that made her jaw tighten with something close to genuine fear, and understood with a clarity that settled cold and absolute into her chest that 6 minutes might be more than this aircraft had left to give. Copy that, she said. I'll hold as long as I can. Below on the ground, Reynolds watched the aircraft above him weave and struggle across the sky, smoke trailing more visibly now, its engine sound carrying a wrongness that made every soldier still conscious enough to look up, feel their chests tighten with dread. She's not going to make it, Ruiz said quietly, almost to himself. Captain, she's not going to hold together long enough. Reynolds didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply stood, wounded shoulder, forgotten, watching the sky, watching the woman who had once again thrown herself into fire for people who had no claim on her loyalty, beyond an old debt neither of them had ever stopped carrying, and felt something in his chest break open with a fear more consuming than anything the battle itself had made him feel. Emily, he said into the radio, his voice raw, stripped of every ounce of command authority. Just a man begging another human being to survive. Emily, if that aircraft can't hold together, you get clear. You hear me? You find somewhere to put that thing down safe, and you get clear. We will hold. We have held this long. We can hold a little longer. Don't you dare risk everything just to buy us another 60 seconds. There was a pause on the radio, filled with nothing but the labored, struggling sound of an engine fighting to keep an aircraft airborne that had given everything it had and was now being asked, impossibly, for more. Copy that, Ghost 6, Emily said finally, her voice quiet, steady despite everything screaming through the cockpit around her. I hear you. But even as she said it, even as the words left her mouth, her hands stayed exactly where they were on the controls, and the aircraft stayed exactly where it was in the sky above the clearing, because some decisions, once made, were not the kind that could be unmade simply because the cost had grown too high. The engine temperature warning flared into solid red, and somewhere behind her, buried deep in the airframe that had already survived so much more than anyone had believed it could, something began, quietly, catastrophically, to fail. 90 seconds later, the first extraction helicopter crested the tree line, rotors cutting through smoke-hazed air, and Reynolds finally allowed himself to lower the radio from his ear and simply watch. Watch the aircraft above him circle one last, labored time. Watch his men begin dragging themselves and each other toward the clearing where the helicopter was already flaring for landing, dust and debris kicking up in a violent storm around them. Move, 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 Reynolds shouted, forcing himself upright despite the fire still burning through his wounded shoulder, grabbing Ruiz by the collar and hauling him toward the landing zone. Wounded first, I want Sanchez and Torres on that bird before anyone else even thinks about boarding. 2 medics from the helicopter were already on the ground, crouching low under the rotor wash, moving toward the wounded with the fast, practiced efficiency of people who had done this before in worse conditions than this. Doc Whitfield, who had spent the better part of 2 days keeping men alive with nothing but field dressings and stubborn refusal to lose anyone else, finally allowed his hands to shake as he helped lift Sanchez onto a stretcher. Above them, Emily watched the extraction unfold through a cockpit that was fighting her on every single control input, the aircraft shuddering and groaning with each passing second. Engine 1 holding at a temperature that still hovered dangerously close to a line she didn't want to cross a second time. Overwatch, Warhawk 1, first extraction, bird is on the ground, loading wounded now. Copy, Warhawk 1, second bird is 30 seconds behind the first. Emily circled wide, keeping herself between the clearing and the tree line, where the scattered remnants of the assault force had pulled back but hadn't fully retreated, watching for any sign that they might attempt one final push while the helicopters were most vulnerable, sitting exposed on the ground. She didn't have to wait long. Warhawk 1, movement! Reynolds' voice cracked through, sharp with fresh urgency. Southeast corner, they're trying to close while the birds are loading. I see them. Hold position. This is going to be close. Emily banked hard, feeling the aircraft protest with a violence that made her teeth clench, and brought the cannon to bear one final time, unleashing a burst that scattered the last organized attempt at interference before it could gain any ground at all. It was, she would later realize, the last sustained burst the aircraft's systems had left to give. The cannon feed jammed almost immediately after, some mechanism inside the weapon system finally succumbing to damage accumulated over the last hour of impossible demands. But it had been enough. Below, the second helicopter touched down, and the remaining soldiers began loading in a controlled, urgent rush, Reynolds himself waiting until every one of his men was aboard before he allowed Ruiz to half-drag him toward the open door. Go 6, Emily said, her voice tight with something that wasn't quite relief yet, not until she saw it confirmed with her own eyes. Confirm all personnel accounted for. There was a pause, filled with the sound of rotor wash and shouted confirmations, and then Reynolds' voice came back, rough with exhaustion and emotion both. All personnel aboard Warhawk 1. Everyone who's still breathing is on these birds. We are lifting off now. Emily watched the 2 helicopters climb away from the clearing, banking toward the open ocean and the long flight back towards safety, carrying 12 men who, 3 hours earlier, had been counting down what everyone privately believed were the final minutes of their lives. She had done it. The relief hit her all at once, a wave so overwhelming it nearly stole the breath from her lungs, and for one dangerous half-second, she allowed herself to simply feel it, to let the enormity of what had just happened wash over her, before the aircraft's shuddering protest yanked her attention violently back to the immediate, terrifying problem still sitting directly in front of her. She still had to land this thing, and there was no carrier deck waiting to catch her. Overwatch, Warhawk 1, she said, forcing her voice back into the flat, controlled cadence of a pilot managing a crisis instead of a woman who had just spent the worst hour of her life keeping other people alive. Mission complete on primary objective. I need immediate guidance on emergency landing options. My aircraft will not survive a return flight to Liberty. The response that came back carried a tension Emily hadn't heard from Ortiz since the moment she'd first launched off that deck. Copy. Warhawk 1. Stand by. The wait that followed felt endless, though the clock on her display insisted it had only been 40 seconds. Emily fought the controls the entire time, feeling the aircraft's remaining strength bleed away in increments too small to measure, but too consistent to ignore, watching her altitude drift downward despite every correction she made to hold it steady. Warhawk 1, we have identified a landing option, Ortiz's voice finally came back. There is a small Allied airstrip on Palawa Island, approximately 40 nautical miles from your current position. Grass runway, shorter than standard, but it's the closest option with any chance of supporting an emergency landing. 40 nautical miles. Emily looked at her fuel gauge, at the fuel line damage warning that had been steadily blinking for the better part of an hour, and did math she already knew the answer to before she finished the calculation. Copy that, Overwatch. I don't know if I have 40 miles left in this aircraft, but I don't have a better option, so I'm turning toward it now. Understood, Warhawk 1. We're scrambling rescue assets to that location as a precaution. Emily banked the aircraft toward the new heading, feeling every mile stretch longer than it should have. The ocean beneath her an endless, indifferent gray that seemed in this moment far more threatening than the battlefield she'd just left behind. At least in the clearing, she'd had a clear enemy, a clear objective, something to fight against with everything she had. Out here over open water, in a dying aircraft with nothing but instruments and instinct to guide her, the only thing she was fighting was time itself. And time, unlike an enemy soldier, could not be outmaneuvered or overwhelmed. It could only be outlasted or it couldn't. 22 minutes into the flight toward Palau Island, the engine that had stabilized once before began, for the second time, to climb toward the red line Emily had prayed she'd never see again. Overwatch Warhawk 1, engine 1 temperature rising again, approaching critical. Copy, Warhawk 1. How far out are you from the strip? Emily checked her navigation display, feeling her stomach tighten at the answer. 11 miles, maybe 12. Can engine 1 hold that long? I don't know, Emily said honestly, because there was no room left at this point for anything except the truth. I'm going to find out. She pushed forward, watching the coastline of Palawa Island slowly resolve on the horizon, feeling every mile stretch and strain against an engine that seemed determined to fail at the worst possible moment, and found herself in the strange, suspended calm of pure survival focus, thinking not of the danger ahead, but of everything that had led her to this exact point. The flight deck, Brooks's initial fury, Hayes's hands on the reinforced strut, the sound of Reynolds' voice cracking with disbelief when he first heard her call sign. None of it had been simple. None of it had been safe. And somehow, impossibly, all of it had been worth it. The runway appeared 6 minutes later, a thin strip of green cutting through dense jungle terrain, shorter and rougher than anything she would have chosen under normal circumstances, but solid ground nonetheless, waiting to catch an aircraft that had already exceeded every reasonable expectation of what it could survive. Overwatch Warhawk 1, I have the strip in sight. Beginning approach. Copy, Warhawk 1. Emergency crews are standing by. You are cleared for emergency landing. Emily brought the aircraft down in a long, careful descent, fighting the sluggish controls every foot of the way, feeling the strain in the damaged nose gear strut with every small correction. Every gust of wind that threatened to push her off the narrow approach line she needed to hold. The engine sputtered once, twice, a stuttering cough that made her heart seize before it caught again, buying her just enough power to hold the descent steady. The wheels touched grass with a jarring, violent impact that rattled through the entire airframe, and for one terrible instant, Emily felt the aircraft shudder and lurch, the damaged nose gear strut screaming under a landing load it had never been designed to absorb even in its original, undamaged state. It held, barely, grinding, protesting, shedding pieces of debris along the runway behind her. But it held, and the aircraft rolled to a stop with feet to spare before the end of the short grass strip. Engine finally, mercifully, dying completely the moment she cut the throttle. Emily sat motionless in the cockpit for a long moment, hands still gripping the controls, breath coming in short, uneven gasps as the full weight of everything that had just happened crashed over her all at once. She had made it. She had actually made it. The emergency crew reached the aircraft within minutes, and when they finally helped her climb down from the cockpit, her legs nearly gave out beneath her. Not from injury, but from the simple, overwhelming release of tension that had been holding her upright through pure will for the better part of 2 hours. Word of the successful extraction and Emily's emergency landing reached the USS Liberty within the hour, and the response on that flight deck, according to everyone who was there that day, was unlike anything the ship's crew had experienced in years of service together. Brooks received the confirmation in the same comms room where he'd spent the morning arguing against a plan he'd been certain was suicide, and for a long moment he simply stood there, staring at the message on the screen, feeling something in his chest that he hadn't expected to feel. Not relief exactly, though relief was certainly part of it, but something closer to a profound, humbling reordering of everything he'd believed about certainty and doubt. She made it, Kim said quietly beside him, her own voice thick with emotion she wasn't bothering to hide. Commander, she actually made it. I know, Brooks said. I heard. All 12 soldiers extracted, Captain Reynolds wounded but stable. Major Carter's aircraft down, but she's alive. Minor injuries only. Brooks nodded slowly, still staring at the screen, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight that surprised even him. I told her this morning that I thought she was making a mistake, he said. I told her in front of half my crew that this plan was insane. It was insane, Commander, Kim said gently. That's not in question. The only question was whether it was going to work, and I was ready to bet my entire career that it wouldn't. Brooks shook his head slowly, something almost like a bitter, wondering laugh escaping him. 19 years of service, and I nearly let my own certainty stop the one thing that ended up saving 12 lives. Kim didn't have an answer for that, and she didn't try to offer one. Some realizations, she understood, weren't meant to be comforted away. They were meant to be sat with, absorbed, allowed to change something permanent in the person who'd finally arrived at them. On the flight deck itself, word spread fast among the crew, and the reaction that spread with it carried none of the mockery that had greeted Emily's arrival that morning. Sailors who had laughed at the sight of an A-10 sitting where it didn't belong now stood in small clusters, trading the story back and forth with a kind of reverent disbelief. Already within hours, turning the morning's events into something that felt less like a memory and more like a legend they'd personally witnessed being born. Chief Hayes heard the news standing exactly where he'd been standing hours earlier, near the empty space on the deck where the A-10 had once sat, and for a long moment, he simply closed his eyes and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since the moment that aircraft disappeared below the deck's edge during launch. "She made it," one of his junior mechanics said, jogging up beside him, grinning wide despite the exhaustion written across his young face. "Chief, she actually made it." "I know, son." Hayes opened his eyes, looking up at the gray sky where hours earlier, an aircraft he'd helped strip down to its absolute limits had disappeared toward a mission everyone had privately believed was closer to a death sentence than a rescue. 19 years I've been working these decks. Never seen anything like what happened today. Don't expect I ever will again. You think that strut held the whole way through? Hayes gave a short, tired laugh. Son, that strut had no business holding through half of what she put it through today. But it did. Sometimes things hold together not because they were built perfectly, but because somebody refused to let them fail. 3 days later, aboard a Navy hospital ship where both Emily and Reynolds had been transferred for treatment and observation, the two of them finally sat across from each other in person for the first time in 4 years. And the conversation that followed carried none of the urgency, none of the desperate radio static, none of the life and death calculation that had defined every previous exchange between them. It simply carried relief, and something quieter, harder to name, that had been building between them since long before that morning on the flight deck. You could have died, Reynolds said, his arm in a sling, his shoulder still healing from the shrapnel wound that had bled through his bandages for most of that impossible day. You do understand that, right? Every single decision you made out there, from the moment you volunteered to fly that aircraft, carried a real serious chance that you wouldn't survive it. I understood it completely, Emily said. I understood it in that briefing room before I ever stepped into the cockpit, and I understood it every single minute I was in the air. And you did it anyway. You did the same thing for me 4 years ago, Emily said quietly. You didn't have to turn your team around. You didn't have to come back for a downed pilot when your objective was already complete and your extraction window was closing. You made a choice that had nothing to do with orders and everything to do with who you decided to be in that moment. Reynolds was quiet for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that Emily recognized because she'd felt the same thing herself more times than she could count. I never thought about it as a debt, he said finally. What I did for you. I want you to know that. I wasn't carrying some ledger, waiting for you to pay me back someday. I know that, Emily said, but I was carrying it, not because you asked me to, because that's what it means to owe someone your life, Michael. It doesn't go away just because the person who saved you tells you it doesn't need repaying. It sits there quietly until the moment comes when you can finally do something about it. And now the ledger's even, Emily said, and something in her voice softened into something that hadn't quite been there before, something that had been building for 4 years without either of them fully acknowledging it. Now we're just two people who happened to save each other's lives, twice under conditions that probably shouldn't have allowed either of us to survive either time. Reynolds studied her for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that went beyond gratitude, beyond relief, into something that felt, to both of them, like the beginning of an honest conversation they'd been circling around for 4 long years. For what it's worth, he said, I'm glad the ledger's even, because it means whatever happens next between us, it's not obligation anymore. It's just choice. Emily felt something warm move through her chest, something that had nothing to do with the exhaustion still weighing down her bones, or the bruises still healing across her body from the violent landing 3 days earlier. Just choice, she repeated quietly. I think I like the sound of that. The story of what happened that day did not stay contained within the walls of a single hospital ship or a single carrier's briefing room. It moved outward, the way stories about courage and impossible decisions always eventually do, carried first through official reports and formal debriefs, then through the informal channels of military culture, bar conversations, hallway retellings, the particular oral tradition that exists among people who have spent their careers doing dangerous things and understand better than most exactly how rare a story like this one truly is. Commander Brooks was asked months later, during an internal review of the mission, whether he would authorize the same operation again if faced with an identical situation. His answer, recorded in the official transcript, was longer and more complicated than the simple yes the reviewing officers had expected. "I want to be honest about something," he said. "My first instinct that morning was to refuse. Every piece of training I had, every ounce of command experience I'd accumulated over 19 years, told me that what Major Carter was proposing was reckless beyond acceptable limits. And by every conventional measure of risk assessment, I was right. The margins were too thin. The aircraft wasn't built for it. The math on paper said this shouldn't have worked." He paused, and the transcript noted a lengthy silence before he continued. "But here's what I've had to sit with in the months since that day. Sometimes the math that matters most isn't the math you can calculate on paper." Major Carter looked at a situation where every conventional option had already failed, where following the safe, cautious, well-reasoned path meant certain death for 14 men, and she chose to attempt something the rulebook said was impossible because the alternative was worse than the risk. I don't know if I would have had the courage to make that same call if I'd been the one sitting in that cockpit. I only know that I very nearly stood in the way of the person who did. That admission, more than almost anything else that came out of the official reports, was the part of the story that seemed to resonate most deeply with the people who eventually heard it. Not the launch itself, not the battle above the island, not even the dramatic emergency landing on a short grass strip 40 miles from where the mission had nearly ended in fire. What resonated was the image of a man in a position of absolute authority, confronted with evidence that his own certainty had been wrong, choosing to say so out loud, publicly, on the record, rather than let pride bury a truth that mattered more than his own comfort. There is something in that admission that echoes far beyond any single mission, far beyond any single flight deck or any single moment of doubt overcome. Throughout history, the stories that endure, the ones that get told and retold across generations, are rarely stories about people who were never afraid, never uncertain, never told by everyone around them that what they intended to do was impossible. They are stories about people who heard that word, impossible, and chose to test it anyway. Not out of recklessness, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that some things matter more than the comfortable certainty of staying within established limits. It was true for the earliest aviators, who insisted flight itself was achievable long after respected scientists had declared it a fantasy. It was true for the medics and nurses who pushed battlefield treatment forward under conditions that established doctrines said were too dangerous to attempt. It was true for every soldier, sailor, and airman throughout the long history of military service who looked at an order that said retreat and chose instead to turn back for someone still trapped behind enemy lines. Courage in nearly every one of these stories rarely looks the way fiction likes to portray it, bold, loud, unshaken by fear. It looks instead like Emily Carter standing on a flight deck, hands steady despite a heart pounding with genuine terror, telling a commanding officer that she understood exactly how dangerous her plan was and intended to attempt it regardless, because the alternative, the safe, cautious choice to do nothing, carried a cost she found impossible to accept. There is an old, often repeated truth among military aviators, one that predates Emily Carter's mission by generations and will likely outlive it by generations more. The rules that govern what an aircraft can and cannot do are written by engineers working with known variables, tested under controlled conditions, designed to protect pilots from unnecessary risk. Those rules are valuable. They save countless lives every single year, and no responsible aviator dismisses them lightly. But every so often, a situation arises that the rulebook never anticipated, a set of circumstances so far outside normal operating parameters that the only honest answer to the question, "Can this be done?" becomes nobody has ever needed to find out. On that particular morning, in that particular ocean, Major Emily Carter became one of the small number of people throughout history who found out. What made her story remarkable was never really about the aircraft itself, extraordinary as that mechanical achievement genuinely was. It was about the decision that came before the launch, the moment in that briefing room when every number on the screen argued against attempting the mission at all, and she chose, with full knowledge of exactly what she was risking, to try anyway. It was about Commander Brooks, a man whose entire career had trained him to prioritize caution and calculated risk, choosing in the end to trust something less quantifiable than a spreadsheet. The simple human recognition that some debts, some obligations to the people depending on you outweigh even the most carefully calculated odds. It was about Chief Hayes and his crew working with a speed and dedication that had nothing to do with orders and everything to do with an unspoken understanding that the person asking for their help deserved every ounce of effort they had left to give. And it was about Captain Michael Reynolds, wounded, exhausted, ammunition nearly gone, choosing in his most desperate moment to tell the person trying to save him to save herself instead. A final, selfless echo of the exact same instinct that had once sent him running back into gunfire to pull a downed pilot from burning wreckage. These are not stories about extraordinary people possessing some rare gift the rest of us lack. They are stories about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, choosing again and again, in small moments and large ones, to act according to what they believed was right, rather than what was safest, easiest, or most certain to succeed. That choice, repeated across battlefields and flight decks and quiet moments of decision throughout the long history of human courage, is what separates the stories we remember from the countless untold stories of people who looked at the word impossible and simply agreed with it. Major Emily Carter did not set out that morning to make history. She did not climb into that cockpit thinking about legacy, about the story that would eventually be told about her, about the lesson future aviators might draw from what she was about to attempt. She thought about 14 men on an island, about a debt she'd carried silently for 4 years, about a captain who had once refused to leave her behind when every reasonable calculation said he should have. She thought about the difference between what was safe and what was necessary, and she chose necessary, fully aware of everything it might cost her. That, in the end, is the truest lesson buried inside this entire story. Not the mechanics of an impossible carrier reactor launch, not the tactical details of close air support over contested ground, not even the dramatic emergency landing that brought a badly damaged aircraft down safely against every reasonable expectation. The truest lesson is simpler than any of that, and far more enduring. It is the understanding that courage is rarely the absence of fear or doubt. It is the decision made in full awareness of both to act anyway because somewhere someone is counting on you to trump on. Commander Brooks laughed when he first saw that aircraft sitting on his deck. By the time the sun set on that impossible day, he was one of the loudest voices insisting that Major Emily Carter's name be put forward for the highest recognition the Navy could offer. Not because she had done something mechanically extraordinary, though she certainly had, but because she had reminded an entire ship's crew, and eventually a much wider circle of people who would come to hear this story, of a truth too easily forgotten in a world that often prizes caution above conviction. Sometimes the person everyone doubts is the only person who can save the day. And sometimes the greatest act of courage available to any of us is simply refusing to let someone else's certainty about what's impossible become the final word on what we're willing to attempt.